Welcome. This is video assignment on the Civil War, Part 1. This is for my classes at NCTC, North Central Texas College, History 1, U.S. History 2, 1865. Fellow students at NCTC, please go back to Canvas and download the review sheets to the Civil War if you do not have them already. For everyone else who's just happened to stumble upon this video, please enjoy. The Civil War will begin. First, a disclaimer. But in the naming of battles in this assignment, the North named their battles after bodies of water, while the South named their battles after the nearest town. A good example of this is the first battle of this American Civil War, the First Battle of Bull Run, also known as First Manassas. Bull Run is the stream, named by the North. Manassas is the town, named by the South. This battle occurred on July 21, 1861, just 25 miles west of Washington, D.C. It pitted Confederate General P.G.T. Beauregard against Union General Irvin McDowell. McDowell had 17,000 troops at First Manassas. Beauregard had 22,000. Both had planned to turn on the other's flank. McDowell succeeded at this, but then Beauregard, before being defeated, was reinforced by General Joseph E. Johnston. This battle is also known for the emergence of one Confederate General, Thomas Stonewall Jackson. He received his nickname here at this battle from a fellow Confederate officer, when the officer was heard to exclaim, "Look, there's Jackson with his Virginians, standing there like a stone wall." Stonewall Jackson will become one of the most famous and most important generals in this American Civil War. The Confederates won this battle as McDowell's retreat back to Washington, D.C. turned into a panic. As it is, fleeing soldiers and terrified citizens who had come to watch the battle clogged the road to Washington. The Confederates let McDowell go, however, as they were just as disorganized and they were exhausted from the battle. The significance of the First Battle of Bull Run, or First Manassas, is that it proved that this American Civil War would not end quickly or without bloodshed, and the romance of war was snuffed out, at least for a generation. It would not be until 1898 before the United States was hungry enough to go to war. After McDowell failed at First Bull Run, President Lincoln turned to General Winfield Scott and his Anaconda Plan. Under this Anaconda Plan, the Navy would blockade the southern ports and dry up the Confederates' access to foreign goods and weapons. Meanwhile, the Union Army of the Potomac would defend Washington, D.C. and place pressure on Richmond. Then, the Army and the Navy would divide the Confederacy along its three major water routes: the Mississippi River, the Tennessee River, and the Cumberland River. It was called the Anaconda Plan because the plan would entwine and crush Southern resistance, much like a spider would strangle its prey. It took Lincoln 3 years to find a commander to implement it. There were naval actions in the Civil War in 1862, most notable being the Virginia, also known as the Merrimac, against the Monitor. The Confederates had taken an abandoned Union steam frigate, which was known as the Merrimac, and turned it into an ironclad ship, which they rechristened the Virginia. And the Virginia attacked Union ships on March 8, 1862. In response, the Union sent their only ironclad, the Monitor, to neutralize the Virginia. These two ships fought to a draw on March 9, 1862. The Virginia was destroyed when the Confederates gave up the shipyard in Norfolk, Virginia. Meanwhile, the Union, under the Anaconda Plan, strengthened its grip upon the coast. Federal flotillas pounded fortifications at Port Royal, South Carolina, into commission. The Navy extended bases along the Atlantic and the Gulf Coast. Admiral David Farragut forced open the mouth of the Mississippi River in the spring of 1862, surprising the Confederate defenders of New Orleans, and New Orleans fell to Union forces. Other than that, little happened in the Eastern Theater before May 1862. The same is not true for the Western Theater, and in this instance I may clarify that Eastern Theater involves the Army of the Potomac, and the Confederate Army of Northern Virginia. Meanwhile, the Western Army involves everything east of the Mississippi River. There's also a Trans-Mississippi Theater, which involves everything west of the Mississippi River as well. We begin with the assault on Confederate forts Henry and Donelson on the Tennessee River. These assaults by the Union were led by Union General Ulysses S. Grant, who moved out of Kentucky. At Henry and Donelson, 12,000 Confederates surrendered to Grant. Grant then moved further south in the Mississippi, following the Confederates, who regrouped under the command of Texan General Albert Sidney Johnston at Corinth, Mississippi. They were 42,000 men strong at Corinth. Grant moved south to capture Corinth. In doing so, he exposed his 42,000 troops on a rolling plateau between two creeks. Johnston realized this mistake of Grant's and ordered an attack. This is the Battle of Shiloh. Johnston's men found most of Grant's men asleep or eating breakfast. And the battle that occurred was named Shiloh because it occurred on the site of a log church. After one day of fighting, Grant's men were pinned against the river. The Confederacy could have won here, but Albert Sidney Johnston, was killed, and his second in command called off the attack. There were over 20,000 casualties at the Battle of Shiloh. And according to Grant, and he wrote in his report, the ground was so covered with dead, one could walk across the field without touching the ground. The significance of the Battle of Shiloh is that, first, it was a battle of missed opportunities. Grant missed his opportunity. Johnston ultimately not just missed his, but lost his. It also showed the tenacity of Ulysses S. Grant. Lincoln was reported to saying upon reading Grant's report, saying, quote, "I can't spare this man. He fights." But after Shiloh, the Western campaign ground to a halt, mostly because Union General Henry Halleck, who was the general-in-chief, took Grant's place as field commander after spreading a rumor that Grant was drinking during the battle. Halleck wanted the glory, not Grant. Meanwhile, over in the Eastern Theater, George B. McClellan replaced Irvin McDowell as head of the Army of the Potomac, and then was named General-in-Chief after General Winfield Scott retired. McClellan was a classmate of Stonewall Jackson at West Point, and as leader of the Army of the Potomac, McClellan set about building the most powerful army in the world. He was excellent organization and a dramatic flair, but his innate caution would be costly. For McClellan kept building and training an army to meet the superior numbers that he claimed that the Army of Northern Virginia had, of which, of course, all those numbers were false. McClellan always had greater numbers and greater supplies than the Army of Northern Virginia. Meanwhile, Lincoln wanted the Army of the Potomac to move directly against Richmond, but McClellan opted against that strategy, instead choosing to enter Richmond from the east along the peninsula that contains Jamestown, Williamsburg, and Yorktown. This is the Peninsular Campaign from March to July 1862. Meanwhile, Confederate President Jefferson Davis sent Stonewall Jackson into the Shenandoah Valley to create a diversion. This kept other Union armies from joining McClellan. At the Battle of Seven Pines, also known as Fair Oaks, Confederate General Joseph E. Johnston attacked George B. McClellan and almost won, but superior numbers by McClellan avoided the defeat. Joseph E. Johnston was wounded and had but lived to fight another day, but General Robert E. Lee took command of the Army of Northern Virginia. Now your two chiefs are set. McClellan tried to dislodge McClellan from Virginia, but failed. While on the Peninsular Campaign, Lincoln visited McClellan on July 9th, and McClellan lectured Lincoln on military matters, conveniently forgetting that Lincoln himself did have some military experience and was well read on military strategy. After this meeting, Lincoln recalled Halleck from the west and demoted McClellan. McClellan was also ordered to leave the peninsula and to join General John Pope on overland assault of Richmond. the Confederacy won this campaign. Robert E. Lee projected a commanding presence. He led by example, and his men loved him. Lee enjoyed Davis's trust. Lee knew how to use his commanders. First there was Jackson, the pious and fearless mathematics professor from Virginia Military Institute. Then there was James Longstreet, the tireless workhorse. And then there was Jeb Stuart, the cavalryman who died in the saddle. Lee fights in the Battle of Second Bull Run, also known as Second Manassas. In this battle, Lee and the Army of Northern Virginia struck at General John Pope before McClellan's men arrived. Jackson was again sent into the Shenandoah Valley as a diversion tactic. This battle was fought on the same site as the first battle. Lee's main army drove Pope from the field, and Pope retreated back to Washington. This got Pope demoted, and McClellan placed back in charge of the Army of the Potomac. But this victory, most importantly, convinced Lee that the time was right to invade the North. Thus, in September 1862, Lee invaded southern Maryland. He was headed for Pennsylvania. Lee's goals in this invasion of the North: first, he wanted to gain foreign recognition of the Confederacy, particularly from Great Britain and France. Second, Lee needed to get supplies for his army, and what better place to get it than in the breadbasket of Maryland and Pennsylvania. And he was convinced that he could defeat McClellan based on what happened at Second Bull Run. He had hoped that a successful invasion would convince the foreign powers to recognize the Confederacy. Thus, he heads to Pennsylvania. This culminates in the Battle of Antietam on September 17, 1862. Lee's strategy is discovered by a Union soldier. He found Lee's secret order wrapped around a bundle of cigars. The paper revealed that Lee had split his army. General George B. McClellan said, "Here is the paper with which, if I cannot whip Bobby Lee, I'll be willing to go home." But worried about enemy strength, McClellan waited. Robert E. Lee was able to reassemble his army behind Antietam Creek. The irony here at Antietam: McClellan outnumbered Lee 2-1. McClellan attacked Lee at the city of Sharpsburg, Maryland, but did not commit his entire army to the fight. The Confederates forced a standoff at Antietam and then fled back to Virginia. McClellan did not pursue them. This inaction would cost him his job. Significance of Antietam: first, this is the bloodiest day in U.S. military history. There are over 6,000 dead and 15,000 wounded in one day. Antietam was just one day, September 17, 1862. But the victory boosted Northern morale, and it dashed the Confederates' hopes of foreign recognition, as no foreign nation recognized the Confederacy. It also is a great splitting off point in alternative histories. If Lee had won at Antietam, could he have won the Civil War? That is one question some historians have speculated. The victory at Antietam also emboldened President Lincoln to issue the Emancipation Proclamation. By the end of 1862, the Eastern Theater was deadlocked. No one can defeat Lee. No one can really defeat the Army of Northern Virginia. The Western Theater was stalled. Grant cannot capture the prize of the Mississippi River, Vicksburg, Mississippi. For his part, Grant did try to capture Vicksburg. He sent a force under General William Tecumseh Sherman to capture Vicksburg, but he failed. And meanwhile, Washington, Lincoln gets it from both sides. Union Democrats call for negotiated peace with the Confederacy. The radical Republicans call for more stringent measures and call the president's competence into question. Lincoln is attacked on all sides. Thank you for watching this video on the Civil War Part 1, 1862, and may the force be with you on your next exam.